Ever heard the phrase, "let them eat cake"? While Marie Antoinette probably never said it, the story perfectly captures the vibe of the French monarchy right before everything went sideways. But the real story isn't just about lavish parties and out-of-touch queens. It's a story of debt, bad decisions, and a king who inherited a financial time bomb. This is the story of Louis XVI, the king who literally lost his head over a balance sheet. When Louis XVI took the throne in 1774, he was just 19 years old. Imagine being a teenager and suddenly you're in charge of one of the most powerful yet financially broken kingdoms in the world. France was, to put it mildly, broke. Decades of extravagant spending and costly wars waged by his predecessors, Louis XIV and Louis XV, had left the royal treasury gasping for air. It was like being handed the keys to a magnificent palace, only to find out it was mortgaged to the hilt and the creditors were knocking at the door. Louis wasn't a bad guy by most accounts. He was well-intentioned, shy, and genuinely wanted to be a good king. But being a good person and being a good leader are two very different things. He was notoriously indecisive, constantly flip-flopping on major decisions. One day he'd support a bold financial reform, and the next he'd cave to pressure from the powerful nobles at court. This waffling created a sense of instability and weakness at the very top, at a time when France desperately needed strong, decisive leadership. So, what was the plan? Louis and his finance ministers, like the brilliant Jacques Necker, knew what needed to be done. The tax system was a complete mess. The people who had the least money, the peasants and the working class, known as the Third Estate, paid almost all the taxes. Meanwhile, the First and Second Estates, the clergy and the nobility, who owned most of the land and wealth, were largely exempt. It was fundamentally unfair and economically unsustainable. They tried to introduce reforms. The idea was simple: make everyone pay their fair share. Tax the rich. Sounds familiar, right? But every time they tried, the nobility and the high-ranking clergy, who had immense political power, threw a fit. They used their influence in the regional parliaments, called parlements, to block any attempt at reform. They saw it as an attack on their ancient privileges and refused to budge. For them, tradition was more important than saving the country from bankruptcy. Louis, unwilling to force the issue and risk a confrontation with the most powerful people in his kingdom, would back down. As if the internal problems weren't enough, Louis made a massive and ultimately fatal financial gamble. He decided to support the American Revolution against France's old rival Great Britain. From a geopolitical standpoint, it was a huge success. Weakening Britain was a major strategic goal, but financially, it was a catastrophe. France poured an enormous amount of money, ships, and soldiers into the war. We're talking about a sum that could have stabilized the entire French economy. Instead, it pushed the country deeper into debt, borrowing more and more money at high interest rates just to stay afloat. Back home, things were getting worse. A series of bad harvests led to a severe shortage of grain, the staple food for most French people. The price of bread, which was the cornerstone of the average person's diet, skyrocketed. People were literally starving in the streets. And while the common folk were struggling to feed their families, they saw the royal court at Versailles, living in unimaginable luxury. The perception, true or not, was that the king and queen were partying while the country starved. This massive disconnect between the rulers and the ruled poured gasoline on the fire of public discontent. The anger wasn't just about bread, it was about injustice. The soldiers returning from America came back with radical new ideas about liberty, freedom, and government by the people. They had fought for a republic, and now they saw the hypocrisy in their own country's absolute monarchy. Pamphlets and newspapers started circulating, openly criticizing the king and the entire system. The financial crisis had morphed into a full-blown political crisis. Desperate, Louis XVI finally agreed to call the Estates General in 1789, a kind of parliamentary assembly that hadn't met in 175 years. It was a last-ditch effort to solve the financial crisis by getting all three estates to agree on new taxes, but it backfired spectacularly. The Third Estate, representing 97% of the population, arrived in Versailles fed up and demanding radical change. They didn't just want to talk about taxes, they wanted a constitution. They wanted a voice. When they were locked out of the main assembly hall, they famously gathered on a nearby tennis court and swore an oath not to disband until they had written a new constitution for France. This was the moment the French Revolution truly began. Louis's indecisiveness kicked in again. He failed to take control of the situation, wavering between concession and confrontation. His inability to engage meaningfully with the newly formed National Assembly alienated the one group that might have saved his crown. From there, events spiraled out of control. The storming of the Bastille, the Women's March on Versailles that forced the royal family to move to Paris, and the king's failed attempt to flee the country. Each event eroded his authority and the public's trust. He went from being seen as a well-meaning but weak father figure to a traitor who had tried to abandon his people. The financial mismanagement that began the crisis ultimately led to the complete collapse of royal authority. The revolution that started as a call for fiscal reform became a movement that would dismantle centuries of feudalism and privilege. It wasn't just about changing the tax code anymore. It was about changing the very fabric of society. In the end, Louis XVI was put on trial by the new revolutionary government. He was no longer King Louis XVI, but citizen Louis Capet. Charged with treason, he was found guilty, and on January 21st, 1793, he was executed by guillotine in the heart of Paris. The beheading of the king was a shocking, seismic event that sent ripples across Europe. It was the definitive end of the Bourbon monarchy and the symbolic death of the old regime. The story of Louis XVI is a powerful lesson in leadership. It shows how a legacy of debt combined with indecisiveness, resistance to change, and a profound detachment from the struggles of ordinary people can lead to absolute disaster. His reign serves as a stark reminder that a government that is not fiscally responsible and is unresponsive to its people is building its palace on a foundation of sand. The financial crisis didn't just bankrupt a kingdom, it swept away an entire world. Thanks for watching, everyone. It's a complex piece of history, and I hope this gave you a clearer picture of how it all fell apart. If you found this interesting, please hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into history. Let me know in the comments what other historical events you'd like to see covered. See you in the next video.